before sunrise. January 1945. Luzon, Philippines. Nearly 100 Japanese soldiers crept through the jungle toward a sleeping American camp. No alarms. No warning. Just steel and silence. Inside a thin canvas tent, one wounded private jolted awake as an officer's sword flashed in the dark. His name was John McKinney. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a fight to stay alive. Alone, bleeding, half-deaf, he fired until his rifle burned his hands. Wave after wave came anyway. 36 brutal minutes later, the jungle went quiet. 40 enemy soldiers lay dead. One man was still standing, and an entire American company was alive because of him. At dawn on May 10, 1942, as the jungle mist still clung to the hills of Mindanao, Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig watched something he knew he would never forget. Long lines of American and Filipino troops moved silently through a clearing, weapons lowered, marching toward Japanese captivity. 78,000 men were surrendering. Fertig was 41 years old, a civilian engineer from Colorado who had spent 6 years in the Philippines designing roads and bridges for mining operations. Now, the island was lost. Japanese forces had landed with crushing strength, and only hours earlier, General William Sharp had signed the order ending all organized resistance on Mindanao. Every American soldier was commanded to surrender and report to Japanese control. Anyone who refused would be tracked down and killed. Fertig understood exactly what compliance meant. Word of the Bataan Death March had already spread across the islands through whispered warnings and jungle messengers. Prisoners beaten for slowing down. Men stabbed with bayonets for collapsing from exhaustion. Others executed simply for stopping to drink water. Thousands never reached the camps alive. As Fertig stood there watching the surrender unfold, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Laying down his weapons was not an option. The Japanese were not preparing prison camps. They were building a system of forced labor and slow death. Fertig stood silently as the final column of surrendered troops vanished down a rutted jungle road, swallowed by heat and mud. At that moment, only two paths existed. Step forward into captivity, where survival was unlikely, or disappear into the jungle, where pursuit was guaranteed. Fertig chose the jungle. Mindanao was vast and unforgiving. More than 36,000 square miles of dense rainforest, jagged mountains, and disease-ridden swamps, larger than the entire state of Indiana. Japanese forces dominated the coastlines, the ports, and the main roads. But beyond that perimeter lay chaos and resistance. Isolated tribal villages clung to volcanic highlands. Muslim communities in the south, hardened by 4 centuries of fighting foreign occupiers, refused to bow. Christian Filipino farmers despised the occupation. And hidden somewhere in that wilderness were other Americans who, like Fertig, had chosen defiance over surrender. He had no rifle, no radio, no supplies, no men under his command. What he did have was 6 years of experience working among Filipinos, and the mind of an engineer trained to build systems from nothing. Against him stood 50,000 Japanese troops, supported by aircraft, artillery, armored vehicles, and warships guarding every shore. By all logic, what Fertig was attempting was impossible. The Japanese response to guerrillas was brutally simple. Capture them, make an example of them, and ensure everyone watched. Public executions were routine, beheadings in town squares, bodies burned alive to spread fear. Within weeks of the surrender, Japanese patrols were sweeping the jungles, hunting down Americans who had refused to lay down their arms. Rewards were offered to any Filipino willing to betray them. Villages accused of sheltering fugitives were set ablaze. Families were executed together as warnings. During those early weeks, Fertig lay weakened by malaria, hiding in a remote jungle camp owned by Jacob Dacher, an aging American settler who had lived in the Philippines since the Spanish-American War. From the cover of the trees, Fertig watched columns of prisoners shuffle down the road below. He saw Filipino civilians beaten for failing to bow quickly enough. He watched an entire nation being crushed under occupation. And in that darkness, a dangerous idea began to take shape. What if the scattered Americans hiding in the jungle could be brought together? What if the fractured Filipino resistance could be unified under a single command? What if an army could be created from nothing, inside enemy territory, without weapons, without supplies, and without any contact with the outside world? It wasn't just unlikely. It was madness. Fertig knew how impossible it sounded. He wasn't a combat commander. He had never led men in battle. He held no authority, no rank, and no legal right to command anyone. He was simply an engineer, alone in enemy territory. But by July 1942, Fertig reached a crossroads that would define everything that followed. What he was about to do would either save thousands of lives or condemn him as a war criminal if it failed. If you want to know how this impossible gamble turned out, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this were never meant to be forgotten. Back to Fertig. He understood one critical truth. In the Philippines, rank meant survival. Filipino soldiers would not rally behind a civilian, especially when multiple senior officers were still hiding across the island. Authority had to be unquestionable. So Fertig made a decision so bold it bordered on insanity. He located a Filipino metalsmith and handed him a handful of old coins. From that silver, 2 stars were forged. And with those stars, Wendell Fertig, mining engineer from Colorado, promoted himself to Brigadier General of the United States Army. By dawn on September 12, 1942, Fertig formally declared himself the commanding officer of all American forces on Mindanao. By midday, Fertig had become the most wanted man on an island teeming with 50,000 Japanese soldiers. His first challenge was clear: legitimacy. A self-declared general with no army, no weapons, and no line of communication with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. How could anyone take him seriously? Across Mindanao, resistance fighters were scattered into dozens of independent bands. Some were former Philippine Army soldiers. Others were civilian volunteers, while a few were outright bandits exploiting the chaos for robbery. And these groups didn't just clash with the Japanese. They fought each other as often as they fought the enemy. In the rugged mountains south of Lake Lanao, Fertig finally found a potential ally: Luis Morgan, a Filipino constabulary captain. Morgan was a mestizo, half American, half Filipino, and had been fighting the Japanese with a small, committed band since the surrender. Morgan recognized something Fertig had suspected all along. The Filipino guerrillas would never unite under a local commander. Tribal rivalries, religious divisions, and personal grudges ran too deep. But there was one symbol that could unite them: a single figure they all respected: an American. And to every Filipino on Mindanao, an American meant one thing: MacArthur had not abandoned them. Liberation was coming. The Americans had not abandoned them. Morgan agreed to serve as Fertig's executive officer, making Fertig the unmistakable face of the resistance, the American general symbolizing the promise of liberation. But even rank couldn't solve Mindanao's greatest challenge. The island was not a single territory. It was a mosaic of a dozen distinct worlds. Not Christians, not Americans, not even rival Moro tribes. And in the remote highlands, isolated pagan tribes had never bowed to any conqueror. Each group had its own language, traditions, and reasons to distrust outsiders. The Japanese exploited every division. They recruited collaborators from every community, spread rumors that the Americans had abandoned the Philippines forever, and paid informants in rice and money to expose guerrilla movements. Every village Fertig entered could be a deadly trap. But an even bigger problem loomed: communication. He had no way to reach Australia, no proof that MacArthur even knew he was still alive, and no means to request desperately needed supplies, weapons, or ammunition. His guerrillas were armed with little more than antique rifles, homemade shotguns, and crude BOLO knives. Some units had a single bullet per man against Japanese troops armed with artillery, machine guns, and air support. Fertig needed a radio. Not just any radio, a transmitter strong enough to reach Australia across 2,000 miles, on an island where the Japanese had confiscated every scrap of communication equipment. In late 1942, he found a potential lifeline in Placido Almendras, a Filipino engineer. Before the war, Almendras had worked in the mining industry, maintaining electrical equipment. He understood radio theory and electronics, and he believed he could build a transmitter from whatever salvage he could find. For weeks, Almendras scoured the jungle, abandoned mines, and wrecked vehicles for parts. Copper wire stripped from damaged trucks. Vacuum tubes secretly hidden by locals before the Japanese arrived. Piece by piece, they were assembling a lifeline that could change everything. A small gasoline engine powered the makeshift generator. Piece by piece, Almendras assembled the transmitter in a jungle clearing, hidden from Japanese patrols beneath the thick triple canopy rainforest. The antenna was strung between two trees and camouflaged with vines. The generator had to be cranked by hand, and the entire station could be dismantled and carried away by porters in under 30 minutes if Japanese soldiers approached. By February 1943, the transmitter roared to life for the first time. The signal was weak, the frequency unstable, and there was no guarantee anyone was even listening. Fertig had only one message to send, one chance to prove to General MacArthur that an American officer was still active on Mindanao, one chance to bring his invisible army into the fight. The message went out into the static, and Fertig waited, heart pounding, for a response that might never come. 3 long weeks later, a faint crackle emerged from the radio. Australia. MacArthur's headquarters had received the transmission. But there was a catch. Anyone could claim to be an American officer. Verification was needed. The Japanese had a reputation for running fake radio stations, designed to trap Allied submarines. MacArthur's intelligence team responded with a series of verification questions, personal details only the real Wendell Fertig could answer: his wife's name, his hometown, the schools he had attended. Fertig answered each one flawlessly. Still, the staff remained skeptical. A mining engineer claiming to lead guerrilla forces on Mindanao, a lieutenant colonel who had self-promoted to brigadier general. It sounded either like a Japanese trap or the ravings of a man who had lost his mind in the jungle. Finally, MacArthur's message was blunt: no promotions to general rank for officers in the Philippines. Fertig would revert to colonel. If he wanted support, he would have to follow orders from Australia, and most importantly, prove that his guerrilla army truly existed. Fertig accepted the demotion, but on Mindanao, he still wore the silver stars. To the Filipinos who followed him, he was still General Fertig. The rank symbolized leadership, hope, and defiance. MacArthur's message was even more powerful. The Americans had not forgotten them. Help was on the way. In March 1943, a U.S. Navy submarine surfaced off Mindanao's northern coast. On board was a single passenger, Commander Charles Parsons, a naval intelligence officer fluent in local dialects who had lived in the Philippines before the war. Parsons had one mission: determine whether this self-proclaimed general was a visionary or simply insane. What he discovered left him stunned. Fertig had built an entire network from nothing. Scattered guerrilla bands were now unified under a single command. Filipino officers were receiving proper military training. Intelligence networks penetrated Japanese-occupied towns. Coastwatcher stations along the shoreline reported enemy ship movements in real time. And all of this was happening in the heart of territory controlled by tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Parsons returned to Australia with a single, undeniable conclusion: Fertig was not insane. Fertig was creating exactly what MacArthur had been waiting for: an army operating behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, rescuing downed pilots, and preparing the groundwork for the eventual American return. Soon, submarines started arriving with greater frequency. USS Tambor, USS Thresher, USS Bofin. Each vessel brought vital supplies, rifles, ammunition, medical kits, and radio equipment. The shipments were modest, usually 4 to 7 tons, but for a force that had survived on homemade weapons, even these small deliveries were game-changing. Fertig organized a precise distribution network across Mindanao. Supplies were landed under the cover of darkness on hidden beaches, transferred onto small boats, and carried up rivers into the jungle interior. From there, carabao-drawn carts transported crates along rugged trails to guerrilla camps scattered across the highlands. Every delivery was a gamble, moving through areas where Japanese patrols could strike at any moment. The enemy noticed the shift. Guerrilla attacks, once sporadic and chaotic, became sharply coordinated, striking key targets with precision. Bridges were sabotaged, supply convoys ambushed, and communication lines severed. Some force, was finally coordinating the scattered resistance. Japanese intelligence scrambled to find the source. Patrols intensified along northern coasts. Captured guerrillas were interrogated mercilessly. Filipino civilians were tortured for information. And gradually, a single name emerged from the chaos: Fertig. By the summer of 1943, the Japanese had put a bounty on Wendell Fertig's head. The amount was never officially recorded, but it was tempting enough to lure any Filipino desperate to survive under occupation. Fertig had become the most hunted man on an island of 8 million people. Yet his army was only beginning to take shape. He understood one truth clearly: guns alone could never hold Mindanao. The Japanese could bring reinforcements, tanks, artillery, aircraft, but they could not govern a population that refused to be ruled. Fertig wasn't merely building an army. He was creating a nation. By mid-1943, Fertig had done the unthinkable. He had set up a functioning civil government across the guerrilla-held territories of Mindanao. The system mirrored the pre-war Philippine Commonwealth. Provincial governors reported directly to Fertig's headquarters, while municipal officials managed local affairs. Courts resolved disputes, postal routes carried messages between towns, and makeshift hospitals treated wounded guerrillas and sick civilians. Schools reopened, teaching children in English instead of Japanese. Most astonishingly, Fertig created his own currency: guerrilla pesos printed on whatever paper could be found. The bills were crude, sometimes hand-stamped, but Filipino merchants accepted them without hesitation. Fertig had promised that when MacArthur returned, the United States would honor every peso at face value. It was a promise he had no authority to make, but the Filipinos believed him. For the first time, the civil government gave the people a reason to fight alongside the guerrillas, not just hatred for the Japanese, but hope for a future they could trust. Fertig's territories offered what the Japanese occupation never could: justice, education, medical care, and hope. Slowly, scattered American servicemen began finding their way to his hidden headquarters: soldiers who had escaped surrender, pilots shot down over Mindanao, sailors from ships sunk in Philippine waters. By late 1943, 187 Americans were serving under Fertig. Former infantry officers commanded combat units. Navy radio men managed the communications network, and Army mechanics kept captured Japanese equipment operational. Every man contributed vital skills that strengthened the guerrilla force. Fertig organized his forces into 6 guerrilla divisions, each responsible for a different region of the island. Division commanders operated with remarkable independence, adapting to local conditions and allies. In the north, Christian Filipino units ambushed Japanese convoys along coastal highways. In the south, Moro fighters used their intimate knowledge of swamps and rivers to strike Japanese outposts and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Perhaps the most astonishing feat of Fertig's campaign was his guerrilla navy. He transformed ordinary merchant vessels into war machines, mounting salvaged machine guns from downed American bombers. Some boats carried homemade cannons, while one daring vessel was armored with spinning circular saw blades scavenged from abandoned lumber mills. These improvised warships struck Japanese coastal shipping with precision, intercepting supply barges and patrolling enemy vessels. In an extraordinary engagement, a guerrilla sailing ship armed with a 20mm cannon even shot down a Japanese medium bomber, possibly the only sailing vessel in the entire Second World War to destroy an enemy aircraft. Meanwhile, Fertig's intelligence network expanded even faster than his fighting forces. He established 58 radio stations scattered across Mindanao. Coast Watcher posts tracked Japanese ship movements and relayed crucial information directly to MacArthur's headquarters. Filipino agents operating in cities under Japanese occupation counted enemy troops, mapped fortifications, and pinpointed strategic targets. When American submarines prowled the Philippine waters, their every successful strike relied on intelligence meticulously gathered by Fertig's network. By June 1944, MacArthur's Philippine Regional Command had confirmed 169 operational radio stations spread across the major islands. Fertig's operation on Mindanao was not only the largest, it was the most efficient. His coast watchers tracked every Japanese ship entering or leaving the island's ports, while undercover agents reported troop movements in near real time. For MacArthur, planning the liberation of the Philippines, this intelligence was priceless. But the Japanese were far from idle. In May 1943, they launched their first large-scale offensive against Fertig's guerrillas. Thousands of troops swept through the northern provinces, burning villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters and executing civilians as brutal warnings. Japanese commanders believed that one overwhelming strike would finally crush the guerrilla movement. They had underestimated the enemy they could not see. The Japanese had completely underestimated what Fertig had built. Their May 1943 offensive was meant to be decisive. 3 columns of infantry surged into the mountains from separate directions. Aircraft strafed suspected guerrilla hideouts, while naval ships blockaded the coast to stop any resupply. Japanese commanders believed they would trap Fertig's forces in a deadly pincer and destroy them entirely. But Fertig had anticipated this. His troops never engaged in a conventional fight. They split into small, agile units that vanished into the dense jungle. Headquarters staff buried radios and documents, then slipped away to prearranged safe zones. Fertig himself never lingered, constantly on the move, never sleeping in the same spot twice. Filipino scouts guided him through trails the Japanese had never charted. Weeks of fruitless searching left the enemy finding nothing but abandoned camps, cold fire pits, and empty supply caches. The jungle had swallowed them whole. Any patrols that strayed too far from the main Japanese columns never returned. Silent ambushes in the jungle claimed dozens each night. Supply lines were shredded by improvised roadside bombs made from unexploded Japanese ordnance. 6 grueling weeks later, the offensive had crumbled. Japanese troops were exhausted, ravaged by malaria and dysentery, and haunted by an enemy they could not locate. They retreated back to their coastal garrisons. Within days, Fertig's guerrillas were back in control. Radio stations buzzed to life again, supply routes were restored, and the civil government reopened its offices. The Japanese tried again in October 1943, then once more in early 1944, but every campaign followed the same disastrous script. Initial advance, fruitless search, mounting casualties, and eventual withdrawal. Each time, the guerrillas emerged stronger and more organized. Slowly, the Japanese command realized the harsh truth. They were not fighting a conventional army. They were facing an entire population united against them. Every Filipino farmer could be a spy. Every village a hidden supply depot. Every jungle trail a deadly ambush. To control Mindanao, the Japanese would have needed to garrison every town, patrol every road, and monitor every civilian. But they simply didn't have the troops. Worse, their brutal tactics backfired. Villages were burned for harboring guerrillas. Civilians were executed as warnings. Prisoners were tortured for information. Each atrocity only strengthened Fertig's cause. Farmers who had tried to stay neutral now joined the resistance, driven by the horrors they witnessed. Young men who had hidden from both sides volunteered for combat units. By mid-1944, Japanese intelligence estimated Fertig commanded over 30,000 armed guerrillas, though the real number was impossible to know. Fertig's organization blurred the line between soldier and civilian. A farmer might plant rice at dawn and carry ammunition to a guerrilla camp by afternoon. A fisherman could transport supplies at night and sell fish under Japanese control the next day. The entire population had become the enemy. Japanese headquarters in Manila reached a brutal conclusion. Crushing the Mindanao guerrillas would require a force larger than the troops occupying the rest of the Philippines combined, resources they no longer had. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, every battalion was needed at the front. Staff officers calculated that 24 additional battalions would be required just to secure rear areas from guerrilla attacks. That meant one Japanese soldier guarding supply lines for every 3 fighting the American invasion. A captured Japanese planning document reduced the problem to a single sentence. It is impossible to fight the enemy and at the same time suppress guerrilla activity. In October 1944, American forces landed on the island of Leyte, less than 300 miles north of Mindanao. General Douglas MacArthur had returned. The liberation of the Philippines had begun. For Wendell Fertig and his guerrillas, everything changed. Years of survival, sabotage, and sacrifice were about to be tested, not in the jungle, but alongside a returning army. For nearly 2 years, Fertig's guerrillas had fought in isolation, surviving on rare submarine drops and weapons taken from the enemy. Now their role changed overnight. They were no longer just resisting occupation. They had become the advance force of an American invasion. Every report they transmitted, every patrol they ambushed, every supply route they served directly weakened Japanese defenses ahead of MacArthur's return. The submarines began arriving with new urgency. USS Narwhal, one of the largest submarines in the Pacific Fleet, could deliver nearly 100 tons of cargo per mission. Crates of M1 Garand rifles replaced worn-out Springfields and improvised weapons. Ammunition stocks grew deep enough to support prolonged combat. Radios, medical supplies, demolition charges, and explosives flooded guerrilla camps hidden across Mindanao's interior. From Australia, MacArthur's headquarters issued clear instructions. Fertig's forces were to escalate attacks on Japanese communications, cutting wires, destroying relay stations, and isolating enemy units just as American forces moved north. Telephone lines were cut, bridges were blown, couriers vanished on jungle roads. Mindanao's Japanese garrison had to be cut off, unable to coordinate with other islands, unable to call for reinforcements, unable to track American movements. Fertig's guerrillas answered with a campaign designed to paralyze the occupation from the inside out. By November 1944, sabotage units severed the primary telephone cables linking Japanese headquarters in Davao to outlying garrisons. Repair crews sent to restore the lines never finished their work. Many were ambushed before they reached the break. When the Japanese shifted to radio traffic, guerrilla direction-finding teams went to work. Hidden operators traced the signals, logged the locations, and passed coordinates directly to American aircraft. Hours later, airstrikes erased Japanese transmitters from the map. The island's transportation system collapsed under relentless pressure. Bridges that had survived years of harassment were finally demolished with American-supplied explosives. Roads were choked with felled trees and wrecked vehicles. Convoys that once moved unopposed now required heavy armed escorts. And even then, they bled men with every mile. By late 1944, the Japanese could still hold cities on Mindanao, but they no longer controlled the island between them. A march that once took a Japanese battalion 2 days now consumed nearly 2 weeks. Roads were unsafe. Supply routes were broken. Movement itself had become a liability. At the same time, the stream of intelligence reaching MacArthur's headquarters swelled to levels rarely seen in the Pacific War. Coast Watcher stations tracked every Japanese vessel entering or leaving Mindanao's waters, often reporting movements in near real time. Agents operating inside Davao counted troop formations, recorded unit insignia, and sketched defensive layouts street by street. By the time American planners began preparing the Mindanao campaign, they possessed more detailed knowledge of Japanese positions there than in almost any other operation across the Pacific. For Japanese commanders, the situation became unsolvable. American forces were rolling north through the Philippines. Leyte had fallen. Luzon was under direct assault. Every available soldier was needed to meet the main invasion. Yet withdrawing troops from Mindanao meant exposing isolated garrisons to relentless guerrilla attacks. Leaving those troops in place meant fewer defenders where American landing craft were already approaching. Mindanao had become a trap. No good options, only worsening ones. The guerrillas had achieved something rare in modern warfare: complete strategic paralysis. Japanese headquarters, running out of time and options, ordered one last all-out offensive. If Fertig's forces could be destroyed before the Americans arrived, entire divisions might be freed for the coming battles elsewhere. In early 1945, Japanese columns once again pushed into the mountains. And once again, they found nothing they could hold on to. Camps were abandoned minutes before arrival. Trails led into silence. Every advance triggered ambushes. Casualties mounted against an enemy that refused decisive battle and simply vanished back into the jungle. The campaign dragged on, unresolved and bleeding men, right up to the moment history overtook it. While the Japanese were still searching the highlands, American forces came ashore. On April 17, 1945, elements of the U.S. 24th Infantry Division landed at Parang on Mindanao's western coast. Commanders expected weeks of brutal resistance. Instead, they walked into the aftermath of a war already fought. Beach defenses had been dismantled. Supply routes were severed. The Japanese units meant to oppose the landing were dead, wounded, or pinned deep in the mountains, trapped by guerrilla roadblocks they could no longer break through. As American units pushed inland, they didn't move alone. They were met by uniformed Filipino fighters who had already been at war for 3 years. Men who knew every ridge, every river crossing, every hidden trail. Intelligence officers who could point to Japanese positions from memory. Combat veterans who had already bled for this ground long before the invasion began. The Japanese garrison on Mindanao, once more than 50,000 strong, no longer existed as a fighting force. It was fragmented, exhausted, and scattered across the mountains. Fertig had done the unthinkable. He had handed MacArthur an island already broken. What planners expected to take months of brutal island fighting was reduced to weeks. Instead of assaulting fortified defenses, American troops advanced through territory where the enemy was already collapsing. The campaign became less an invasion and more a pursuit, tracking shattered Japanese units driven into hiding by years of relentless guerrilla pressure. The roles had reversed. The same jungles where Japanese troops once hunted resistance fighters now became their prison. By early June 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Mindanao had effectively ceased. The island was free, not because of a single landing, but because of a war fought in the shadows long before it. A few isolated Japanese units continued to hide in the deep mountains, but the war on Mindanao was effectively over. They no longer posed a strategic threat. An island that had once required more than 50,000 Japanese troops to control was secured with remarkably light American losses. In the years that followed, military historians would quantify what had actually happened. Fertig's guerrilla forces had killed more than 7,000 Japanese soldiers during the occupation, wounded thousands more, and immobilized an entire enemy army, troops that could never be used against American forces elsewhere in the Pacific. MacArthur summoned Fertig to headquarters. The same commander who had once questioned whether he was delusional or a Japanese deception now recognized him as one of the most successful unconventional warfare leaders in U.S. history. What Fertig accomplished had never been taught at West Point or any military academy. He created a functioning army from nothing, deep inside enemy-controlled territory, without supply lines, formal authority, or initial support. And he held an island larger than Taiwan against a modern, fully equipped occupying force. Recognition followed, but it arrived quietly. Fertig was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. The citation noted that he had sustained his mission despite a standing bounty on his head, operating for years in constant proximity to the enemy. He also received the Distinguished Service Medal for organizing and commanding a disciplined, highly effective fighting force that confined Japanese troops to heavily fortified enclaves instead of allowing them freedom of movement across the island. The Philippine government later granted him its highest military honors, and among the people of Mindanao, Fertig was remembered not as an occupying officer, but as a liberator. Yet the recognition that mattered most to him never came from medals or ceremonies. It came from the men who had served beside him. Filipino guerrillas who had fought tanks and aircraft with homemade weapons. American soldiers and sailors who had refused surrender and survived 3 years in the jungle. Coast watchers who risked execution to report enemy movements. Radio operators who kept fragile transmitters alive under constant threat of discovery. Together, they had created something unprecedented, an underground army that did more than endure. It altered the course of the war, and the consequences of that achievement reached far beyond the mountains of Mindanao. Across the Philippine archipelago, resistance forces forced Japan to commit an estimated 288,000 troops away from the front lines. Nearly 1 out of every 4 Japanese soldiers was tied down performing rear area security, guarding roads, depots, bridges, and towns against partisan attacks. Every battalion assigned to protect supply lines was a battalion not defending beaches against American landings. Every soldier hunting guerrillas was one fewer man behind a machine gun or inside a bunker. The Filipino resistance effectively multiplied American combat power without requiring additional American lives. Japanese commanders eventually recognized the trap, but by then it was too late. Their own after-action reports described the strategic contradiction they could not escape. Suppressing guerrillas demanded manpower. Pulling manpower from combat units weakened defenses. Weakened defenses accelerated American advances, and faster advances left even less time to eliminate the guerrillas. The cycle fed itself. There was no solution. In Washington, military planners studied what had happened in Mindanao. An engineer with no formal special operations training had achieved what conventional armies often failed to do. He had turned occupied territory into a weapon and forced a modern military to fight an enemy it could never fully see, let alone defeat. Fertig had grasped a truth most armies learned only through failure. Guerrilla warfare was not about body counts or dramatic victories. It was about organization, about legitimacy, about earning the trust of civilians and turning everyday life itself into resistance. An occupier did not collapse from one decisive blow, but from constant pressure, 1,000 small wounds that never healed. Those lessons would echo far beyond the jungles of Mindanao. As the Cold War began, American strategists realized future wars would not always be fought on open battlefields. The ability to organize resistance behind enemy lines became a strategic priority. The military needed leaders who understood what Fertig had learned the hard way, without manuals, without doctrine, without support. When the war ended, Wendell Fertig returned home in late 1945. He was 54 years old. He had survived 3 years hunted by an occupying army, living on rice, jungle trails, and sheer resolve. His hair had turned white. His body was scarred by repeated malaria attacks. But his focus was already forward, Because what he had built in Mindanao was not just a wartime victory. It was a blueprint. As the Cold War dawned, American military planners understood that future conflicts would demand exactly the skills Wendell Fertig had mastered in Mindanao: the ability to organize resistance networks, forge armies from local populations, and wage unconventional warfare against far stronger opponents. Fertig was called to shape the next generation of American warfare. From 1951 to 1953, he served as a Special Forces Plans Officer and Deputy Chief of Psychological Operations at Army Headquarters in Washington, D.C. There, he helped establish the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the very foundation of what would become the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, the cradle of the Green Berets. Every Special Forces soldier trained at Fort Bragg would study doctrine that traced directly to the lessons Fertig had learned in the jungles of Mindanao. He retired from the Army in the mid-1950s, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond any single battlefield, a blueprint for unconventional warfare that still shapes American military strategy today. Fertig returned to Colorado, running a mining company until his death on March 24, 1975, at the age of 74. He never sought fame. He never penned his own account of the war. Instead, he allowed others to tell his story. Yet in the Philippines, Wendell Fertig was never forgotten. When he revisited Mindanao after the war, thousands lined the streets to welcome him. Some wept as they sang, "God bless America." He had given them something far beyond weapons or supplies. He had given them hope, the assurance that they had not been abandoned, and the promise that liberation would come. One military historian would later rank Fertig among the 10 greatest guerrilla leaders in history, alongside names like Lawrence of Arabia and Mao Dong. An engineer from Colorado, who had never commanded troops before 1942, had transformed scattered refugees hiding in the jungle into an army of 35,000. He had turned the impossible into reality and left a legacy that would echo through generations. Fertig returned to Colorado and ran a mining company until his death on March 24, 1975, at the age of 74. He never sought fame. He never wrote his own account of the war. Instead, he let others tell his story. But in the Philippines, Wendell Fertig was never forgotten. When he returned to Mindanao after the war, thousands lined the streets to greet him. Some wept, singing, "God bless America." He had given them far more than weapons or supplies. He had given them hope, the certainty that they had not been abandoned, and the promise that liberation would come. Today, military historians rank Fertig among the 10 greatest guerrilla leaders in history, alongside names like Lawrence of Arabia and Mao Dong. An engineer from Colorado, who had never commanded troops before 1942, had turned scattered refugees hiding in the jungle into an army of 35,000. He had achieved the impossible and left a legacy that would inspire generations to come. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a forgotten story. We're bringing to light incredible tales of engineers, guerrillas, and ordinary people who changed the course of history with homemade radios, sheer courage, and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the Philippines. Our community spans the globe. You're not just a viewer, you're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Share your location. Share your story. Your engagement ensures that Wendell Fertig and the men he led never fade into silence. These heroes deserve to be remembered, and thanks to you, their legacy lives on.